Right, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. This is In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo, and I'm also known as the Urban Birder. And before I go any further, I've got this exciting man I want to introduce you to. He is the man. If I didn't come out of lockdown, and if I was still in lockdown, he would be the last memory of a human hug that I had from anyone. And I remember that I can describe that hug so vividly. But before I start talking about that hug and that man himself, I must say that this whole series of interviews in Conservation With is sponsored by Leica Nature and Birding, and also by an organization called King's Place Music Foundation based in King's Cross, London. And this is part of their Nature Unwrapped season, which lasts until the end of the year. So they're basically doing that to cover this, sponsoring our thing under that guise. So thank you to those two guys. And the other thing is, I have to mention that I'm doing a walk in London for those who could be in London. And I can't remember what date it is. It's October, but I'm pretty sure that Claire will put it on the main chat and you'll see it. And that's the walk I'm doing. It's called the Walk with the Urban Birder. That's it, and that's me. So if you come to England from America, you can come on this walk. So without any further ado, Chris Woods from eBird. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. How are you?
It's great to see you. I too remember that hug very fondly. And so it's nice to have good memory of some human contact from what seems like a different lifetime ago.
Yeah, it certainly is, actually. Just to put it all in context, guys, Chris and I last hugged. Our last hug was actually in Spain. Chris came to Extremadura, which is a region in Spain. In fact, the region in Spain I'm actually in now, because I shortly afterwards was caught in lockdown here in Spain, which was quite draconian compared to some other countries around the world. And Chris was on a press trip to look around the region, and I was lucky enough to be along to hang out with him as well. Extremadura, just for your information, is a region which is the 5th largest in Spain. It's 5th out of 17 regions. It's for your size reference, for the Americans amongst us, it's just a little bit smaller than Kentucky. So I don't know how big that is, but it's obviously quite big. And for the Europeans amongst us, or the British actually amongst us, it's twice the size of Wales. And for the Europeans, it's about the size of Switzerland. So that's how big it is, but it's only populated by under 1 million people. And the region is obviously fairly rural, and it is one of the best places in Western Europe for birding. So that's why I'm here, and I've been in lockdown ever since. But we had a hug then. Did you enjoy Extremadura, Chris?
Even more than your hug, if I could be so bold.
Any chance of elaborating on your
experience? You know, it's such a amazing part of the world. You know, you have these rolling plains, and then you have incredible canyons. The raptors that you're able to see in such a small area is really remarkable. I mean, I think the thing that I'll treasure most, you know, is with you and Martin and a lot of other people walking across the plains and hearing all the larks singing. They're just magical.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Extremadura is a fantastic place for raptors. There's been records of up to 23 different species of raptor nesting in the region. And it's the best place in Europe to watch the old world vultures. For my money, the real vultures. I mean, obviously you have vultures, but they're not quite the same, are they? And we have the Griffon Vulture and the black vulture, the two species that, I mean, obviously not obviously, we also have the Egyptian vulture, but the black and the Griffon are the two that we see most regularly flying around Extremadura. And the black vulture obviously is very different to your black vulture, the American black vulture, because the Eurasian black vulture, which is also known as the cinereous vulture or the monk vulture, is in fact the largest raptor in Europe, actually. And it's pretty big, isn't it? 9-foot wingspan, so it's pretty big.
Yeah, that was fun.
So anyway, we're not here to talk about Extremadura. We're here to talk about you, Chris, and about eBird. You and I, we go back a little way. We met a few years ago, and we kind of hung out for a little bit. But we had our main sort of hanging out this year in February. But can you just kind of give us a brief breakdown of how the young Chris stepped onto this planet and suddenly picked up a pair of binoculars?
Yeah, you know, when I was a kid, I was really into dinosaurs, like 4 or 5 years old, and like a lot of kids maybe growing up in the U.S., I had a little sandbox in my backyard, and I would look for fossils. And I was fortunate to grow up right on the front range of Colorado, where Denver the plains hit the Rockies. Maybe part of the reason why Extremadura kind of reminds me of home. And so there are incredible fossils to be found. You know, you can go and find Stegosaurus and not just trilobites, but, you know, real fossils. My sandbox, though, was not quite so good for fossils. And after a couple of years of diligently searching in a sandbox about the size of this room, I decided there probably weren't any to be found. And about the same time, I got a bird feeder, and this bird that I'm sure a lot of people from the U.S. and those from elsewhere have seen him can really appreciate. An evening grosbeak came into the feeder, and I was just hooked. You know, having a male evening grosbeak sit there. My mom could tell when there were good birds coming to the feeder, because I would often take my thermometer, you know, from taking a temperature. This is back when you could hold it up to a light bulb to give yourself a fever, so that you could stay home and enjoy the birds that were coming to the feeder. I feel bad for kids these days, because I don't think it's as easy to play those tricks anymore, but I'm sure they have their ways now.
Yeah, I think if you play that trick now, you may be misdiagnosed with coronavirus.
Yeah, there's some dangers in doing it now.
It's funny you mentioned evening grosbeak. I mean, I've only ever seen evening grosbeak once in my life, and it was in the Catskills Mountains. Is that how you pronounce it, Catskills?
Catskills.
Yeah. There was that particular year, that winter, it was -10, and I couldn't get out the car for longer than 10 minutes at a time. And I was wearing 4 coats, I was wearing a scarf wrapped around my head, 2 hats, and I was still freezing. But I remember standing by someone's feeding station, and all of a sudden these gorgeous grosbeaks came in, evening grosbeaks, and I got my camera out to take a picture, and it was point blank range, and my camera battery was dead. Oh, I was so disappointed.
Yeah, I wish I could say I've never been there.
So tell me, how did you kind of, you got into birds, became a birder at a young age. What happened from there? How did you end up being the director of eBird at the Cornell lab?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, starting out when I was a kid, I was very fortunate to have just incredible mentorship. There was a guy starting when I was 12 years old named Joey Kellner, who I met at a Denver field ornithologist meeting. You know, these are the meetings that were at the Denver Museum of Science and Nature, and I met him, and he basically, starting at age 12, he would take me out almost every weekend, show me birds. My parents are both, you know, awesome, but not particularly interested in birds. My mom's a gardener, and my dad helps out with that. But so the process of having that mentorship, and then, you know, the birding community being what it is, and you can sort of see it around as we look around who's on the call today. You know, it's still relatively small, and you can make connections quickly. So I became friends with a lot of people. And when I was in graduate school, John Fitzpatrick, who's the director of the lab, asked if I would join the advisory panel for eBird. And this was very, very early on. eBird had gone on for a couple of years, and so I helped with that a little bit when I was in school. And then the opportunity arose where they were looking to hire somebody as a project leader for eBird. And unbeknownst to me, a really good friend of mine, Brian Sullivan, he applied at the same time, and the two of us came in and have worked on eBird together. And now Brian is focused on this really cool initiative called the Birds of the World, which brings together, you know, some of the content we have from eBird with content with the Macaulay Library, you know, all the videos and sounds that are held in the Macaulay Library at Cornell, along with the text from the Handbook of Birds of the World that Joseph Del Hoyo and that incredible team at Lynx put together, along with the Birds of North America Online, which was a big collaborative effort. So it's been fun to just sort of see how these different pieces have come together. One other thing I'll mention, just because I thought of it, is I had the opportunity to go to something called Camp Chiricahua. And these are these bird watching camps that Victor Emanuel has put on. And at camp that year, you know, I met people like Andrew Farnsworth and Marshall Iliff, both of whom now I work with at the lab. So it's just I couldn't be more fortunate to be where I am today.
That's fantastic. For those who, I mean, obviously you're going to be talking more about eBird in depth, but it is a novel approach, as you say, to citizen science by engaging, you know, diverse communities of people across the world interested in birds. And when I first came across eBird, I always felt, well, not always felt, I felt at the time it was very American. And I was thinking, well, why am I using it in Britain or in Europe? And that was further sort of demonstrated to me when I picked it up and looked at it. And I was seeing species that I thought, hang on, what's this? What's a greater whitethroat? What's a white-breasted cormorant Atlantic race? And I was thinking, are you guys just making all these names up? And I even felt like ringing you up and saying, look, I'll write all the European names out for you. Please, let me do it. And then when I met Chris in despair at Bird Fair a few years ago, and by the way, we have the godfather of bird fairs here, by the way, Tim Appleton. I can't see him, but I can feel his presence. Basically, I remember coming up to you and I was just about to throw my mobile phone against the wall and saying, that's it, I've had it with eBird. I want to love you. I want to really love you, but I just can't do it because you have all the wrong names. And then all of a sudden you just picked the phone up. In fact, it was your wife, Jessie. She picked the phone up and she pressed a couple of buttons on my app. And all of a sudden, like magic, great tit, great, disappeared. And it became just great tit. And common whitethroat appeared instead of greater whitethroat. And I thought, hallelujah, I am now on board. And it was so easy to use.
I often have those hallelujah moments with my wife.
I'm sure you do. But let me just read what it says about eBird. So watching birds around, along with conservation biologists, quantitative ecologists, statisticians. What do you use long words for? Statisticians, scientists, application developers, and data administrators. The problem I've had is I've been speaking all day today, not in Spanish, unfortunately, and sometimes by the end of the day, it's a bit difficult to actually articulate what you're trying to say. But it's interesting, you're saying the community has collectively spent more than 70 million hours collating effort-based checklists, amassing more than 850 million records, which have been used in over 250 peer-reviewed publications in the last 5 years. So that's pretty impressive figures.
It really is a humbling experience, and I have the privilege of working with an incredible team here at the Lab of Ornithology, and then also more broadly all around the world. I see several people who are regional editors or perform help us in various ways. I saw Jim Zook, who was really one of the first people that started helping and really giving us insight into how we would able to run eBird in Costa Rica, and he for many years was the person involved in eBird in Costa Rica, and now that's expanded to a much broader team. But it's for me it's really special because birds have this way of connecting people all around the world, and whether you call it a common whitethroat, a greater whitethroat, it's a rose by any other name, right, David? And once we can get past that and understand and allow each other to sort of see the way and that we relate to birds, and allow and technology is a way that can allow us to do this. I mean, who would have thought that we could all come together and talk about birds in this amazing way that you've been able to allow us to? And you know, birds bring us together, and I think that's one of the pieces of magic there. And then the power of linking birds with these really novel scientific approaches that allow us to now make use of, you know, 850 million records is really transformative, and it's special. And you know, people like, you know, everyone on this call, you mentioned the amount of effort. It unfortunately gets to be a number that's sort of like thinking about the deficit in the U.S. It's so large that it's sort of without context, it's hard to understand. So the number of person hours of people, you know, going out with their apps, putting in the list of birds that they're seeing, you know, having the track of where they went and counting the birds, that's the equivalent of more than 8 times the number of person hours that it took to build the Empire State Building. So there's a huge volume of participation, and you know, for me and I think the entire eBird team, it's a real humbling experience for us to be able to try to guide this this train.
Yeah, I mean, going back to my earlier perceptions of the app, I mean, as I said, I thought it seemed quite American-centric at first. But now I understand it more. I see how popular it is, obviously in North America, but also in the Americas per se. And in Spain, for example, where I am at the moment, it's the go-to app that people use to actually collate what they're seeing. And I remember after that eureka moment with your wife, I remember, you know, being in Spain and starting to sort of collate what I was seeing. And it was quite interesting when you can actually look back and see, oh, actually, I noticed that I saw that here last year. And you begin to see a pattern, which I noticed before when I used to just keep notes handwritten or on my computer. It's only when I suddenly realized that I ended up 17th in the region in terms of my number of species I've seen, that I suddenly thought, hang on a minute. It gave me a whole different burst of life, because not only is it something which is a citizen science instrument, which obviously, you know, gets people thinking about what species are turning up where and why and how often, but it also backs up your kind of general kind of hunter-gatherer spirit, which is, I've seen 200 and whatever species, let's go and see if I can find more. So it kind of has at least a dual purpose or dual drive. But the question I want to ask you actually is it something that you want the whole world to be using? I mean, it sounds like a stupid question, but in the UK, for example, I don't seem to feel that it's caught on as much as other European countries, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the real critical thing is that in Europe, there are many different projects that are gathering data. So BirdTrack, that the BTO is really the lead organization behind, is an incredible app that allows, that basically is the same idea. And these data that are brought together in something called the EuroBird portal, which brings together data from Ornitho, from BirdTrack, from Tractellen, from eBird, and for Europe, you know, is a way that people can go and explore the patterns of those birds. So there's a variety of different platforms that people can choose, and sometimes what I know some of my friends do is they may use sort of their local homegrown system when they're at home, because that enables them to have those really strong relationships with the conservation NGOs in their country. And then when they travel, they'll use eBird. That's something that I see quite a few people do. But I think what we all agree on is being able to participate in some way and share your records is what's really important, and that we as the science and conservation community are finding ways to pull these data together in really innovative and fun and interesting ways. So, you know, if you're in the UK and you think that BirdTrack is really working for you and you like the way that it works, you know, I don't want to say to switch over. You should keep using BirdTrack. You know, if you like some of the features and things that are in eBird, then we're certainly happy to have you. You can use both. I mean, I think there's a lot of different approaches in terms of what different systems do. And the important thing is to pick one or several systems and to share what you're seeing, because there's such a value now in being able to. We're starting to appreciate what we can do by having, hundreds of millions of records.
Do you, in the UK, for example, do you work with people like BirdTrack, the BTO, and with Bechtel in is it Holland? Netherlands? Yeah,
so I know that you think that the reason that I went to Spain was to go bird watching. There were actually a few other reasons, and one of those is that there was a Euro Bird Portal meeting, and so that was one of the times where people from the different conservation NGOs, and then also the folks that are running the different technological platforms, come together and talk about interoperability of data. What are some of the best practices that we can have? And so a lot of those things can focus around, I'll talk about one of them, which is the idea of like a complete checklist that includes effort information. And that's something that, that BirdTrack does really well. They've done it from the inception. And the idea is that there's sometimes a challenge in understanding why people want to report something. And is it because it's, interesting, or is it because it is something that's rare? A lot of times bird watchers historically, I think particularly in the UK, Europe, and the US, have been really motivated by rare birds. And so you tend to get a lot of reports of things that are really, really rare, and not as many reports of things that are common. And so when a scientist is trying to analyze those data, it gets to be very difficult to tease apart observer behavior versus bird behavior. So what we're trying to do, along with all these other groups, is to be able to tease apart the observational process, the human process, from the biological process, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. So that's why, when you use eBird or BirdTrack, there are these sort of annoying questions where we ask people, you hit start, and we ask you where you were, and we ask that you allow us to sort of have a track of where you were. And it keeps track of how long you were out birding, because if you were out for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, or 2 hours, the number of birds that you're going to be able to detect is going to be very, very different. And we also ask people to report complete checklists. So here in the US, what that might mean is, maybe you hate European starlings, and I do apologize to you, David, and the friends on the other side of the pond. But there are some people over here that are not fond of starlings. Maybe it has to do with the fact that they failed their 9th grade Shakespeare exam, and the reason that starlings were brought over here is, so that all of the birds from Shakespeare's plays could be in Central Park. And in the case of European starling, which, by the way, wasn't even the right starling from the prey, but that's a digression. We don't know all of the things that are going on in people's minds about why they might not report that starling. And so what we really try to emphasize is report all the birds that you're able to see and identify, and then to try to come up with an estimate of how many. And what that allows us to do then is to infer when you don't find a bird. And those absences or lack of detection, which is a little more accurate in terms of what they are, really are powering a lot of the science that we're able to do right now. Because not only do we have information on where birds are, but we have information about where birds are not.
It's really interesting, because when you talk about compiling and giving a complete list, there's a byproduct, really, which I've discovered, which is you're in a location, you're knocking out all the species you've seen, and you think, oh, that's a common species, and all of a sudden it says not reported. And it's almost like seeing a news, oh my God, this has not been reported in this location. I'm the first. I am the first. And it just makes you feel excited as much as seeing a rare bird. That gives me a kick, actually, when I see that. And I know
it's the same for me too. We have these visual displays where for people, you can go up and choose to keep track of the birds you see in your garden or your yard or your patch. And over time, what happens is we have these frequency charts that basically show, you know, the seasonal occurrence of when you find birds. And what I found has been really fun is you know, we basically thought we knew everything about birds, right? Like they've been studied for hundreds of years. And now when you're able to sort of dig down at a micro level, you start understanding that there are these really strange movements and things that take place. So just this morning when I went outside, you know, we're in the middle of summer. There should theoretically, if you read the bird books, there should be no bird movement happening right now. And there was a prairie warbler outside our house, and that was only the second prairie warbler that Jesse and I have ever had. So there's these interesting things that are happening. And to me, I think, you know, the analogy I sometimes draw is that it's like a treasure hunt. And, you know, bird watchers are sort of reading these clues, and there may not be some sort of treasure map, but it's a matter of thinking about what the weather's like, thinking about what the winter maybe was like, thinking about all of these different patterns that we think over time, having watched birds, we think birds might be keying into, and then figuring out like, oh my gosh, this is something new. And for me, you know, those surprises of like a prairie warbler, even though I could go 10 miles from here and there's prairie warblers that breed, it's not a rare bird, but right here in my place, you know, it's really unusual. And sort of the fun of being able to make those discoveries at a very, very local place for me would almost be as exciting as having been in Rhode Island and seeing the Chiricahua sandpiper. Almost.
Was there one there, was there?
There was. There have been three, you know, they have redneck stint, little stint, Chiricahua sandpiper. There's all sorts of things showing up in Rhode Island these days.
It's interesting you mentioned Chiricahua sandpiper, because I don't know if I gave you this quiz. Maybe the Zoomers can think about this quiz. There are 3 species of North American bird, and by that I mean 3 species of bird on a North American list that have a scientific name. Their genus name begins with X. And you just mentioned one of them, Chiricahua sandpiper. What are the other 2? And that is a question that I need the answer to by the end of this session.
Is Leica gonna chip in a binocular for the winner of that? They're sponsoring this, so maybe not.
Well, these are hard times.
You're asking the questions. I apologize. I'm stepping out of my role.
Chris. These are hard times. Debbie Bear. I mean, she said Debbie Bear, even not Bear. She said, "I love how eBird appeals to the human side of birding activity. The satisfaction in creating a list, the thrill of counting the numbers, competing with self, as well as fellow birders in county, state, or regional lists. eBird is a full throttle sport measured by the list competitions." Great fun. Which is basically what we've been talking about here, because a few other people have actually agreed with that. There's a question here from Vicky Blake. What is the relationship between eBird and BirdNet?
That's a good question. BirdNet is part of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's part of the Conservation Bioacoustics program. And so BirdNet is a app that they've developed that is a sound ID app. And it's in the early stages. There are kinks that are being worked out still. But the idea is to help identify bird sounds. That was BirdNet, not Bird Track, right? It
says BirdNet, yeah.
Yep.
And what do you think about, there's a few other apps that have suddenly appeared now that rely on people to submit their lists. What do you think about those? Because I've noticed that 1 or 2 of them are I'm not sure where the information is going to. And obviously it'll never be as complete as eBird, but what do you think about it? Do you kind of encourage that sort of thing?
You know, the devil's always in the details, right? And I think as long as these are you know, part of the real challenge is, and I'm going to take a couple steps back and say why we really like people to use eBird to report the data. And that's because of that issue that we were talking about earlier about the difference in birdwatcher behavior versus what the birds are actually keying into. So within the eBird app, there's a lot of thought that's given to make it as easy as possible to hit the start button and for the app to be recording information that can allow the science team at Cornell to use that to then go and figure out other things about that place. So we work a lot with NASA. We're one of the largest users of NASA's data in the world. And what we do is we take the track that you have where you've walked, and then we link it with remote sense data that NASA's gathering. So that can be things like, could be elevation, it could be habitat type, it could be whether something is 50% grassland and 50%, let's say, corn or some type of agricultural crop. But then even how that's distributed. So there are lots of small patches, or is it two big patches that sit next to each other? All of those details, if we were to ask a person to sort of keep track of all of that, would make eBird about as fun to use as going to the dentist. And so, and I do apologize to any dentists out there. I mean, it's a tremendously important job, and I thank you for the work that you do. But but it's not the most fun thing to do. I mean, let's be honest. And so what we can really do from that information is allow bird watchers to focus in on what's really the fun stuff. So, you know, report the birds you're seeing, count the birds. If you see breeding behavior, you can add that. You can add some comments if you want about what you're seeing. And then we have that effort information, and we have the track of where you went, and that is incredibly useful for any of the types of science that we do. And then what we do, you know, our emphasis is to try to if you think of it in a negative light, you could say have complete control over the data collection. But then we make sure that all of the data are open and accessible to researchers, to scientists, to educators, to be able to use those data. And so we have both the ability for people to go in and download the data, and there's also a series of APIs, which is basically a way that programmers can go in, they can write some commands that basically allows them to take the data from eBird and then extract it and put it into another database. So like when we share data with Euro Bird Portal, they're basically pulling that data out through these various APIs that are written. And so that's the reason why we really try to emphasize some of the data collection, because there's an incredible amount of thought that really goes into how we do that, and then allow other people to come up with a variety of creative ways to visualize and display those data. You know, and the world's really limited only by their creativity, and that's why you mentioned sort of, you know, more than 250 peer-reviewed publications. Most of those publications have been done by people that are not scientists at Cornell. They're scientists really all over the world that are using those data.
Do you think there's a pressure on users of eBirds to A, get the ID completely right, and B, as Suzanne Starr has she commented on, she prefers to list without counting? Is that a problem for your data? Because what advice would you give regarding counting? Because, for example, when I'm out birding, I don't actually count every single bird I see. I think about it mentally. I've seen roughly 30 Spanish sparrows, and then later on in the evening or the day, I think myself, well, actually, maybe I've seen 85 because I saw another massive flock somewhere else. How important is it to be exact when it comes to the counting, and is the counting important?
Yeah, so let me start with yes, the counting is really important, but we're trying to get an order of magnitude. And so I wouldn't agonize over whether there's 80 or 81 pintail. There's you know, 75, 80, 85. What we're trying to get at is sort of that there's a, you know, what the count is, and we want to be able to differentiate 85 from 5, from 850, from 3,000, because those are significant differences. And what our ultimate goal is with eBird, you know, if we sort of take a couple steps back, is, you know, if you think about one of the most transformative things in sort of the last 100 years or so, I would argue it's been the radar system and our ability to understand weather. And so we have early warning systems now when there's hurricanes in particular, but also to some extent tornadoes, hailstorms, all of these things that could cause risk to human life and property. What we're trying to do is to build an analogous system with a different type of sensor network. So instead of using radar to do this, we're using people. And people can still do something that, as yet, even the best machine learning approaches can't do, which is to go out and detect birds, count birds, be able to separate different individuals, and then put them together into a list of birds from a location. And then what that gives us is it allows us to see how those change over time. And so that might be from 1 week to the next, from 1 month to the next, from 1 year to the next, with the idea being that birds, because you find them across every single habitat, and because you find them in every country in the world, are really good indicators for natural systems overall. You know, birds are out there, they're singing, they're not like mice or shrews or butterflies that often are hiding and very difficult to detect. Birds, compared to anything else, are much easier. And you know, you can look at the number of people gathered here today. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world that are interested in birds. So we can understand, the idea then is to use these data and be able to develop sort of early warning indicators to say, wow, you know, something is happening here. Why is that happening? Where is it happening? And that, right now, the best way that we have of doing that is through, you know, birdwatcher data from all around the world, which is a pretty exciting thing to me.
Yeah. Before we carry on, Scotty TV is the only person that got the 2 other species beginning with X, the genus names. Sabine's gull, which is X-E-M-A, that's Zema, yeah. And then yellow-headed blackbird is the other species. So there you go. You can use that in a pub quiz, as we say in England. Have you got anything to show us, by the way, Chris? Because I know you've got some little graphics, so I'd love to see.
I always have things to show if people are interested. Claire, if you could let me share my screen, I would be very happy to.
You should be able to, because you are co-host.
Yeah, when I click on it, it says the host has disabled screen sharing for me. But
that's because I wasn't happy with you, but now I am. So you're co-host.
I mean, that's it. I'm sometimes not too happy with myself either. I understand. Let me.
So basically, just while you're doing that, Zoomers, just to let you know, but if you are unfamiliar with this, if you want to see it in the best possible way, get off the gallery view and go on to speaker view, and then that way you'll be able to see the whole screen, as opposed to seeing it as a tiny corner in your actual vision in the gallery. So that's one way of doing it. And also keep your questions coming in. For example, Kate Richardson, most of my birding is on organized tours, i.e. Vent. What's Vent?
Victor Emmanuel.
Oh, Victor Emmanuel, okay. Do Victor Emmanuel guides enter data from these tours? Seems like they would be the best sources, as they certainly see more than I do and are more reliable as to what and where and when the birds are seen.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of guides for Victor Emmanuel, for Sunbird, for Field Guides, BirdQuest, that are all using eBird. Can I ask a quick question? Are you seeing just something that says eBird status and trends, or are you seeing a whole bunch of like other stuff too?
I'm seeing the bottom line, the bottom of your presentation is the rest of it. So you're not
all
on,
right.
You're not on slideshow.
Yeah, let me.
So whilst you're doing that, Karen Kellett's asked a question as well, but maybe we'll do it after this.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's great.
So, you know, I touched upon some of this before, so I'm not going to give the whole presentation, but the way that we think about sort of this early warning indicator system or ways of using birds to understand natural system is something we call the eBird status and trends. And so a lot of you are probably familiar, like if you open a field guide, you see sort of a map that looks like this. And a lot of conservation work can be started by maps. You know, if you overlay a bunch of threatened species maps and ranges on top of each other, you could figure out these might be areas that are important to conserve. What we're able to do now, though, is to bring together all of these observations, link them with NASA data, and develop models that will allow us to see where birds are every week of the year. So hopefully what people are seeing now is the map of this bird, ruby-crowned kinglet. It's a lot like goldcrest or fightercrest. And you can see the relative abundance and how that changes. So it's January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. I mean, this is amazing. You know, you can see how birds change from one week to the next, how birds connecting people, in this case, you know, from Mexico into Canada. And then we can look at these data in a variety of different ways. So we can say, okay, well, we're interested in where ruby-crowned kinglet's found in the summer, where it's found in the fall, where it's found in the winter, or we could sort of overlay that on top of each other. And these are all very data-driven approaches to be able to understand the status and distribution of birds. And if you compare that, you know, you're able to see that ruby-crowned kinglet is more abundant in the Rockies, you know, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Ontario, than it is in sort of northeast or in the Pacific Coast ranges and the Sierra Nevada of California in the breeding season. You can also sort of see there's just so much more texture to these. I wanted to show a lot of eBird began in the US and Canada, and the idea for eBird to actually go international, it was not at the lab. I think a lot of people have a misperception that that this is sort of a Cornell or US run project only. The idea for eBird to go international was actually somebody, Humberto Berlanga, who works at Canabio in Mexico, and he was watching what the lab was doing and saying, this would be a really cool system if we could be able to use this in Mexico. So the whole idea of expanding eBird into Mexico across the Americas really started with Humberto, which I think is a pretty powerful thing. You know, most of the really good ideas that get implemented in eBird are from the community around the world. But now, as I mentioned, there is a lot more use in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And so what we can start to do now is look at the patterns of birds in other places. And this might be a little hard to see, but one thing that you might be able to see is there's actually two shades of gray on the land here. And those are differences between where we have sufficient data to model the distribution of Eurasian blackcaps. So if you see in sort of England right now and sort of southern Scotland, there's that gray. That means we have enough data to say that they're not there at that time of year. And then this background color that's in Russia and through Libya and Algeria, Egypt, that means we don't have enough data. So we draw that distinction based on the amount of data that we have. So we're starting to be able to visualize and model bird migration, you know, both in Europe, and then also in this case, we'll look at barn swallow throughout the entire world. And again, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see that in Africa, there's this big pale white area where we don't have enough data in places like Chad and the Sudan. But we do in a lot of Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. So, you know, this is still very, very early on in what we're trying to do. But let me just explain a little bit more about sort of how we go about doing it. And so a lot of people are familiar, you know, we have the website, the eBird website, and then we have the mobile app. But there's a lot of partnerships, and that's the main way that we work. So eBird is now, and the mobile is, I think, in 32 different languages. Bird names are in something like 60 different languages because there's various versions of Spanish and things that are supported. But we also have these different portals, and so there's the eBird site overall, but then there's a project. You know, this is the portal for Israel. eBird Israel is what that says, I think. Then there's specific applied projects that we have. So there's other scientists and researchers that are trying to have focal studies that they're trying to do. And so one of those are different breeding bird atlases. And we can use the overall application infrastructure that we have within eBird and then put on a different sampling protocol, which basically means we're trying to steer bird watchers to do things in a certain way. And then that allows us to gain additional insight into particular specific questions. Another example of that would be working with the International Shorebird Survey and Manamit. They collect their data through a specific protocol that people are following that asks a few additional questions that gives a little bit more insight than just the sort of general birding that's done every day. And, you know, this is done through all of these different portals and partnerships that we have. I don't have a chance to sort of show anybody, but since you're in Spain, I thought I'd highlight, just to give an example of within Spain, this is the group of people that are all working together collaboratively on eBird in Spain. And it's a pretty cool thing. And since you brought up yellow-headed blackbird, I figured we did not plan this either. People may think that we did, but a really good illustration of why those complete checklists are important, I think, is by looking at yellow-headed blackbird. So if we look at where people have submitted photographs and video of yellow-headed blackbird, basically what you see is it looks like they're all over the U.S., except they're not in maybe eastern Montana, South Dakota, western North Dakota. We don't have photographs from there. And if we actually go in, though, and we look at frequency, so now we start to look at those checklists where people are reporting all the birds that they see and then look at the percentage where they're reporting them, what we're seeing is that people are not uploading photographs where the species is most common. And what we found is in a lot of different reporting schemes where people are just reporting sort of the highlight species, the places where birds are most abundant is where we're not getting the information. And so you can sort of see that just without even controlling for effort or controlling for how much time people are spending, just sort of putting all of the checklists together, you can start to visualize that. To analyze these data, we actually have a very complicated data process. And basically what we're doing is, you could think of it as niche modeling on steroids. And I'm going to spare all of you going through this in great detail, but basically we're performing hundreds of thousands of niche models at different times of the year and in different places, because the habitat associations that birds have change sometimes from one week to the next. And they also change in different regions. So we can't do sort of one big distribution model for all of the world. We have to do small models and then run them for different periods. And then when we overlay those on top, that's what allows us to sort of see the distribution of yellow-headed blackbird, you know, in unprecedented detail in a way that we never would have been able to before. And so if I sort of flip back to, you know, if we were just giving highlights, this would be sort of what we might take home. And then this, with a very sophisticated analysis, is what we can actually see. So there is, it's true that all these data are being generated, gathered by bird watchers, and that's the engine that makes everything work. But then there's a complementary, very sophisticated statistical and computer science approach in terms of how we actually can bring these data to life. And so that's probably enough on that, but I thought it would just be fun for people to see some of the ways that those are, that we can visualize those data. And then what gets really exciting is when we have that information, there's so many different conservation use cases of how those data can be used. And so there's examples of how the Nature Conservancy in California has taken the data and said, okay, you know, this is shorebirds move through based on eBird data at this time of year. We know that there is not much water available on the landscape at this time of year, but we're in the Central Valley of California, which is the most intensive agricultural area in the world. We can't buy and create some preserve, which is, you know, the Nature Conservancy has done an incredible job with that approach. And so they started thinking about, you know, what could we do for birds that are moving through a very short period of time? And the idea was really to rent the land. And so the approach that they took was to identify by using eBird data the times and places where shorebirds would be most likely to occur if you could create habitat for them. And then they did reverse auctions and basically asked rice farmers, how much would we need to pay you to put water on the landscape during a time when the landscape isn't being used for rice production? And what happened as a result of that is some of the largest concentrations of shorebirds that have ever been recorded in the Central Valley of California, you know. And that was an idea that sort of, you know, started with being able to sort of visualize and then think creatively. And there's just a huge amount of excitement right now, I think, to think about how you can combine different types of data sets and that they're really complementary. So it isn't that citizen science is better than sort of science that's done by experts in terms of focal surveys. It's that they can be very complementary. And an example of that, that would be a good one that I could touch on briefly is the work we did, Orrin Robertson in particular did with tricolored blackbird. And tricolored blackbird, you know, by combining data that we were able to see on survival and productivity from very specific types of analyses, along with eBird data, allowed us, and in this case, I mean Orrin and the science team, I have nothing to do with this, to create these integrated population models that then can start to explain why bird populations, where is it and when is it that these drops in bird populations are taking place. And so it's this bringing together of data that can just be really exciting. So some really cool stuff, David.
That's amazing. You want to unshare your screen now so I can see your beautiful face again?
Oh, yeah.
Good. So that's really interesting. It's also spawned a lot of questions as well. I'm thinking, okay, where do we start actually?
Luckily, we have 1 minute.
Sorry?
Luckily, we have 1 minute to tackle them all. So,
well, what we could do, we could just do one quick question, and then we can move from there to say goodbye, and then we can have the after show party where we can actually quickly run through some other questions as well. I think some of them have already been answered by you. Neil Singleton says, does pushing the 2 buttons on the app that you referred to have the same effect as allowing your location to be used on your smartphone?
Yeah, Neil, I'm not sure I understand that, but basically when you're using the app, the mobile app, so either on an Android or an iOS device, and you hit start, the default option is basically to allow us to record the track. So if you hit start, that information's just happening in the background. And then you can go in and then see sort of the track of where you went, which is sometimes kind of fun to do. I like to sort of, after a tour, come back and you know, look exactly where I went for my walks and stuff like that. It's kind of a fun way of doing it. If you have older data that you're not actually gathering at the time, basically what you do is you plot a location on a map. And that's not quite as good because you have one sort of point that represents sort of a walk. but it still is better than nothing. And the science team can account for the difference. And there's the way that we sort of tag that information is different. We understand if you're using sort of one point to describe it, or if we have the track and then can get a better idea of sort of where you actually were.
Okay. Karen Kellett has asked, I still don't understand how stating that you are submitting a complete list of what you can identify is the most useful data. What about the species I can't identify that are there? Just because I can't identify them doesn't mean they're not there.
That is a great question, and there's a complicated answer. But basically, what we think of is there's a lot of different types of bias that we're trying to control for, and bird watchers in some ways are like a sensor network. I think I mentioned that before. And what we're trying to do is to calibrate different sensors to each other. So what we want to do is if we take as the gospel that David Lindo is the best birder with the best species, you know, in terms of his ability to go out and detect and identify everything that's seen. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but we're stating our assumptions. That's something that's important in science. We're stating that our assumption is that, you know, he's sort of a very good sensor and can identify and count things accurately. Then what we can do is we can start understanding the differences between different sensors. And so we don't have your name and we don't have sort of a number that goes along with it. But what we are able to do is understand the difference between when David goes out and when my mom goes out. And my mom is she's very, very good sensor at counting the number of lesser goldfinches that come onto the bird feeder. But if there's a yellow warbler that's chipping, she's probably not going to detect that. But because we have this huge volume of data, we can actually understand those differences. And so what you've told us by answering yes is that to the best of your ability, you're going out, you're trying to record those, and we're able to see that you may not be, nobody, even David, is not detecting and identifying everything that's being seen. But we're able to see, you know, across time, there's people who, you know, a lot of people that start using eBird when they're young, we're able to see that they detect more species in less amount of time as they go bird watching more, which makes sense. As you gain experience, you learn the songs, you learn the calls, and you can detect things more quickly and identify them more accurately. And there's people like me, I'm getting older, my hearing isn't quite as good anymore. So I'm in this phase where now maybe I'm not detecting as many birds as maybe I was 2 or 3 years ago. And what it is these are just realities and differences. And it's not, you know, we could take a simplistic view and say that, you know, somebody's a better sensor or a worse sensor, but that's actually not true. What we found is that being able to understand and calibrate different sensors in the same way that you were to calibrate a radar system or a network of thermometers to understand measurement error is fundamentally that's the same type of calibration that we're doing. And so calibrating between different bird watchers is a way that actually allows it so that beginning bird watchers can use eBird and the data aren't quote unquote screwing things up. Now, if I take a couple steps back, there is certainly a point where, you know, we do need people to be able to identify birds accurately. And so part of what we're seeing it with so many people being forced to stay at home is they're finding birds maybe for the first time. And in that case, you know, it's really good to start with something like Merlin, which is really designed as a way to build this sort of fundamentals and what you look for and how you identify birds, because it's really hard to do. And part of what's really hard is for a lot of experts, we know the status and distribution of all of the birds when we go around because we've been looking at birds for a long time. And so when you go out with an expert, part of the reason that they're able to identify birds really quickly is because they are making a lot of assumptions about probability. And so if you hear something that sounds, there's this whole group of birds in the US that sort of have similar sounding flight notes, yellow warbler, black-bill warbler, Connecticut warbler. At this time of year, yellow warbler is the only thing that goes zeep that's going to be anywhere around here. So very quickly, I can make people amazed by that. And with Merlin, Merlin is basically more amazing than I am, because you answer sort of a series of questions, and then the same questions that you as a bird watcher would try to do. So what's the size and shape of the bird? What are the colors of the bird? Where did you see it? Was it in a tree? Was it in the ground? Was it at a feeder? Was it flying around in the air? And so it teaches people to sort of start looking at birds. And then hopefully over time, what happens is people, and then it asks you the most important or equally important pieces is, where are you and when were you there? And then it hits the eBird database that basically has how common all these birds are at different places. And it's able to say, okay, these are the birds that are most likely there. And so this is a project, since we have a lot of people from the UK, that we put out with BTO in collaboration with them, where there's different packs for different parts of the world that basically allow people to identify these birds. So if you're just getting started, Merlin and field guides are good ways. And I have some exciting news there. Part of what we'll be releasing in Merlin in the next 2 months or so, or 3 months, is going to be the ability for people to start saving the birds that they see in Merlin, so that they start gaining some of the basics and how things are done in eBird, and it creates an entryway for the huge increase in number of people that are finding birds. Thanks really to people like you, David.
Oh, okay. Well, listen, we've come to the kind of hour point or beyond that now. I'm thinking that there's quite a few questions still, and if everyone would like to stay on for the after show, we can quickly ask those questions. But before we go to the end, let me just ask you 2 questions, which I may not have briefed you on. So, Chris, this is your starter for 10. What is your favorite species of bird?
Oof, let's say great gray owl today. It's usually whatever I'm looking at.
And notwithstanding coronavirus and that terrible pandemic we're suffering at the moment, if you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you be?
Oh, I do love Colorado. It's a wonderful place. Let's say the Pawnee National Grasslands in Colorado right now, real special place. Reminds me of Extremadura, as I think we talked about.
Really? Okay, that's interesting. And whilst I have you all there, Zoomers, let me just tell you what's coming up. Tomorrow, we have a lady called Gillian Burke, who is a presenter on a BBC TV program called Spring Watch, but also Autumn Watch and Winter Watch. And she'll be talking about being a woman in natural history. And on Monday, we got this guy called Chris Watson, who is actually, amongst other things, David Attenborough's sound man. So it's a really good opportunity to ask about David Attenborough. He's been on before, and one person asked that question right at the very end before we left. So maybe you can come in earlier talking about him, David Attenborough. But anyway, Chris Watson, we're talking about recording birdsong and recording wildlife generally. On Friday the 17th, we've got another BBC TV, well actually he's done quite a few other channels, but he's a TV presenter called Nick Baker, wildlife presenter. His main thing is about insects, so we'll be talking about bugs. On the Monday the 20th of July, we got another American, Darlene Cavalier. It's a lovely name, Cavalier. She'll be talking about the field guide to citizen science. Do you know that lady at all? Have you met her before?
I haven't. I know the name, but I've never met her.
Okay, well, nor have I. So we're going to be talking to her on Monday the 20th. On Wednesday the 22nd, I got another really interesting woman, Holly Morgan. She's an artist based in the UK, in London, and she creates these amazing pieces of art using taxidermy, and she's not even a taxidermist. And her art is bought for 6 figures even, by various art collectors. So it'd be interesting to see how she does that. And then we got on Thursday, the 23rd of July, a guy called Robert Oates, and he'll be talking about, he's written a book about being a grey-haired birder, and he's going to be talking about getting senior birders traveling, which is not often you hear about. That's normally about getting younger people involved. He's trying to get more senior people involved. And so far on my list, the last person for now is a guy called Doug Tallamy. another fellow American. He's going to be on here on the 27th of July, and he'll be talking about his vision for a grassroots approach to conservation. And have you got his book there, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll be having him here on the 27th. So that's what's coming up. Please feel free to join in. They're all free. Thanks to our sponsors, Leica Nature and Birding and King's Place Music Foundation. Chris, thank you so much for a very informative hour and a bit talking about the workings of eBird. I feel so excited. I even feel like going out and just recording a few things on my list, like my 3 pairs of house martins nesting in my balcony right at this very moment. And thank you.
Thank you, and thank everyone for joining. This has been really, really fun.
Yeah, and thank you, Zoomers, as well. And as I always say, please take care of yourself in these troubling times and other people as well. And don't forget to keep looking up.